Welcome back to just another solar podcast with Luke Beattie, that's me, and Karl Jensen. Hey, Karl.
Afternoon, Luke. How you doing?
I'm good, mate. How's your week been? You've been all over the countryside again.
I have. The price of diesel's definitely front and centre. $180 to fill an I-load van these days is, I hope, motivating our industry to try and move at least their sales towards electric cars.
In the meantime, you're actually between work vehicles and you've been finding another way to the office.
Yeah, I did about 500 Ks on the e-bike last week, which was in some horrific, cold, wet, raining conditions. But I guess I need the exercise, but it's not that much fun when you get rained on for 4 hours in a day.
What's the distance between home and the new office?
It's 61 Ks each way.
Far out. And how fast does the bomber go?
The bomber will do 80, but not on a trip that long. And I try and stay off the road, and you just can't go that fast on the bike path. So it takes me an hour and a half, hour and 45.
Today's special guest is Thomas Bywater from Jinko Solar, Australia. Mate, I have to say your title's a bit of a mouthful. It's National Channel Sales Manager for Distribution.
Yeah.
I got that right?
You just say Chief Copymaker.
Welcome on board, Thomas.
G'day. How are you going?
Very good. So what's happening in your world at the moment?
Well, it's solar, so it's crazy, right? It's always crazy. If it's not crazy, you have to pinch yourself. You've got to wake up from the dream. It's typical stuff, right? Prices are going up. The technology's changing. The standards are changing. All the usual stuff, Luke.
Yeah. Well, the first half of this year, the last 6 months, you could say that the panel market in Australia has been an anomaly. The rest of the world's been talking about the upstream costs going up and cost of modules going up and squeezes in supply chain, whereas Australia's been quite the opposite.
Yeah, it's been really challenging for the distributors. So distributors have prepped for the forecast that they've got from the market. There's been a lot of bad weather. And then, of course, when it's raining, you can't install panels. And it was raining for almost 6 months, not non-stop, but pretty regularly across Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, sort of that main tract of the country. And in other parts of the world, for example, down in Bunbury, we had some connection challenges. And in South Australia, we've got some dialing back of rebates. So there was a lot of momentum sucked out of the industry. And so distributors were selling panels at a loss. So what that effectively means is the installers were able to buy below the cost of production of the panels, right? And it also meant that smaller installers were potentially on a better price fitting than a large business that was trying to buy panels at that time. So if you're a large retailer going to market in March, looking at the prices in China, or maybe if you're buying from Europe or America, that'd be substantially higher than what you could get from a distributor. So all of a sudden, the big players in the market are having to buy from the distributor, and the man in the van is on the same footing. It's very hard for the big players to wrap their head around that fact.
Thomas, certainly the distributors that I've been working for, we thought that the formats had settled down. We've gone from 370s to 390s. There's still people in the market saying, have you got any 370s? We prefer 370s because they're an easier size to handle. And now we're looking at a scenario where, well, obviously Jinko had a 440 that's been in the market for, a little over a year now?
It's been in since 2020, so it's basically got about 2 years of market traction on it, that 440, yeah.
So the 440s, and now I hear we've shrunk a row of cells down to 415 and 54 cells.
Yeah, pretty much. That's the go. There'll always be upheaval in solar, so if anyone ever says to you, oh, this is how it's going to be for the next 3 years, you know that they just don't know what they're talking about. But yeah, that panel type, which is the 182, very common in the market now, that 182 cell. The smaller version of it is 54 cells, which, as you said, is basically taking a row of cells out of the 60 cell panels and gives you 415 typically, or we also make a 425, but for most people, the market will be about 410 to 415, that sort of a range.
So this gets harder and harder for anyone who says, oh, your system's upgradable. It gets a lot harder.
Exactly, man. Upgradable. When I was a young fella installing back in the early 2000s, probably before most people were born, I don't know. But now it was, at that time we used to sell the SB 1700 which was a SMA inverter. We put 6 panels on it, I think, and the idea was that you could put another 6 on at a later point. And of course, you never could. And I felt bad because, in good faith, did that to help people to have a pathway to get a bigger system, but later just practically couldn't do it. And even if you say, let's get Enphase or let's get Solar Edge, let's say you put a bunch of Enphase on this year, they'll probably be able to take a 400-watt panel or something. In 4 or 5 years, it'll be a 500-watt panel. You won't be able to swap panels on those either. So just no way to upgrade a system is what you basically got to say to people now.
Or just also finding service panels too. We get calls all the time just for people chasing 250-watt, 260-watt modules, and they're harder and harder to come by.
And they 100%. Want to pay peanuts for them.
So where's it going to go?
Peanuts, yeah, of course.
They want to pay peanuts, yeah. Back in the day, mate, they were 75 cents a watt. I've been sitting on it for the last 5 years. It's worth $1 a watt. Get started, you know.
So where's it going to go then? The 182 mil cell, is that going to be a standard? Are they going to get bigger and bigger? Where's the roadmap heading?
Yeah, so there's 2 sort of trains of thought there. I'll just dial back and say why we do 182 cell and we don't do 181 or 190. Why is it 182? It's based off the size of the container's doors. So with the size of the container's doors being a constraint, so in engineering, I think you call that a bounded design or something like that. But essentially, we know how high that door is. And if you're going to have 2 pallets, one on top of each other, and we know that pallets, let's say 10 centimeters thick, and that's already been thinned down to about as much as it can do without being able to still be able to get the forks in on a typical forklift. So they used to be about 15 centimeters. They've got thinner and thinner, the pallets, which you might not have noticed. But essentially, the 182 cell is derived from fitting within that door of the container. Now, the other type of way you could go is do maybe a 210, and that's actually cut down from the 300 mil wafers that are used for semiconductors. So the 2 philosophies are, let's save money by using something someone else is doing, which would be the semiconductor, like tacking onto what they're doing or piggybacking. And the other way is to think, well, freight's a main cost of the industry now. Let's fit exactly what can get inside the container into the container. So that's where the 182 comes from.
What are we at? What fits in a container? What's the magic number now in kilowatts, Thomas? Just for people that don't know.
In kilowatts, I probably couldn't tell off the top of my head, but if it was 415s that you mentioned before, it'd be 936 of those panels can fit in. That's with a 30 mil frame. So if there's a thicker frame, it'll be less, obviously. But in terms of where the industry is going, we think the width of panels will be pretty static because of that constraint. But you'll possibly find that people start to make cells that are rectangular or different profiles such that they keep that width, but they maybe end up with a longer cell or something like that. That's a direction that some guys are looking to head. And of course, you've got the HJT and the N-types and all these other ways to make more watts in the same panel.
It's interesting. I just punched that into the calculator. It's 388 kilowatts from 440 watts. Back when Luke and I started bringing in containers, back of the envelope, it was 200 kilowatts in a container.
So the calculation used to be, it was 5 containers per megawatt. Then it went down to 4. Now it's down to 3 or sub 3 containers.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
It's a basic calculation. Does the weight and the size of the panels come into the calculation at all?
It does. So if you get, for example, a container now with double glass panels, potentially that container is overweight if it's loaded onto a truck, considering the combined vehicle's mass. Then you would potentially have to pay charges from the port, whereas before you didn't. So you don't always win just by putting more and more panels into the container. But typical 40-foot high cube with 415s in it is still okay. Like, it's around the typical mass or maximum mass of a semi-trailer. As soon as you do a project like, let's say you do a solar farm, then potentially you're going to be overweight for bridges that are on the way to the project. Potentially you're going to have to pay a weighbridge surcharge when you leave the port.
Hadn't thought of that particular problem before, Thomas. There's always seems to be a new trap for young players in the solar farm space.
And there's a movement, like you were saying, towards higher efficiency. So we're seeing a lot of heterojunction, TopCon, N-type, a lot of N-type. So with Jinko, you seem to be moving towards N-type now.
Yeah, that's a decision that's been made pretty resolutely, in the sense that they've invested, I think, in 45 gig of production capacity for that, which is pretty material. That'd keep Australia going for 20 years or something. That annual capacity, they could do that because they did a share market raising. So Jinko was one of the last big companies to do a share market raising in China. So probably we won't see those kind of moves by others because they've already done capital raisings. So there'll be a little bit of a constraint, I guess you could say, on how much more R&D people can do because of the ability to raise cash. But having said that, there's a really solid pathway with N-type to use the TopCon that you see now. So we've already gone past PERT, which we were talking about a few years ago. Oh, it's amazing, PERT, and now we're doing TopCon too. And pretty soon you'll see some back contact variants of the TopCon product. Then other people do HJT, as you said. Pretty exciting times if you're a nerd, a solar nerd.
For those that don't understand production capacity, I was having a bit of a back and forth with someone on Facebook as to what it takes for a module manufacturer to have, say, 45 gigawatts, or I hear Longi's around 100 gigawatts of capacity, and they're running it at 75 or 65. They've got spare capacity in the bank. What kind of money are we talking? What does it cost to set up, say, 10 gigawatts of production?
So I couldn't really answer that for you, Karl, but we are talking in the billions of dollars. That has been invested in the 45 gig. So if I'm not incorrect, it was something in the vicinity of 4 or 5 billion has been put into that. But the question becomes, are you doing just modules with that money, or are you doing cells? So in the case of Jinko, they build a whole lot of ingot facilities in the south of China because there's hydroelectricity. So it depends what level of detail are you getting to with the spend? Is it just lick and stick, which is where you get the cells from somewhere else and put them in the glass laminate, or is it full service, So, but yeah, we're talking billions of dollars, right? So if you just want to do module assembly purely, I think it's about 100 mil per gig for module assembly as a rough number.
It's a lot of money. So, I mean, again, we're always disappointed that we're not making anything in Australia. And I made a few references to it in last week's show, The Big Switch. And of course, Australia having some ability to not only provide renewable energy to the world, but we should have enough spare renewable energy here that we can be making steel instead of just exporting iron ore. And similarly, we should be making silicon.
Yeah, silicon actually, personal opinion, I think would be something you could look at doing here. The module assembly and the other things are heavily subsidized in the other countries. So it doesn't matter if it's Germany, it doesn't matter if it's Korea or China. They've all got massive subsidies. And Australia as a country has shown that they are not wanting to do that. So if we look at the vehicle industry, for example, if we look at the steel industry that you've mentioned, they're not interested in investing in that. So I don't think you'll see, for example, $500 million loans to do solar plants to build panels here in Australia. But silicon is something that's very mining aligned. Australians can wrap their head around that. It's a bit like Burrup fertilizers, or a bit like Port Pirie. We've got the zinc smelter. It's things that people could probably understand the fundamentals of very easily. The problem with that is that it's not that labor intensive. So the beautiful thing for solar for China is there is a lot of packaging. There's a lot of data that's got to be kept. You've got to do a lot of movement of cells and ingots between factories and things, and that generates a lot of jobs, which is their sort of key interest in it. And in Australia, we'd probably do a highly automated approach. So the government probably look at it and go, it's very automated, doesn't give us any jobs, not really interested, potentially. That'd be their philosophy.
But then you look at someone like Fortescue Future Industries, who are committing to a lot of jobs and multifaceted, not just producing modules, but also, electric trains and electrolyzers and all the whole gamut of stuff there. So it's going to be really interesting to see if, the private sector is the one that pushes us towards potentially mining for the silicon, but certainly for the ingots to cells, to wafers to cells to modules, somewhere in that supply chain.
Well, that Sun Cable project up there is the kind of thing that would underpin manufacturing if you're going to do it. So if you turn around and said, well, we're definitely absolutely 100% going to do these 2 gigs up here to export power, then you can imagine it might make sense to put a module assembly plant in a Geraldton or in a Karratha, or probably in Perth, somewhere where you've got good transport connections, but it just takes out that sea transport leg. And maybe you do bring in cells to Australia and assemble them into modules. I don't think you're going to see a big ingot pulling line here in Australia. It's just too expensive and too volatile, the demand for it.
Right.
But potentially you would see silicon get exported to another facility overseas, turn into cells, come back, get put into panels. That's probably viable.
Sun cable's not 2 gigawatts, so it's more like 20, yeah?
Yeah, sorry. I'm out of date with the figures. But what I'm trying to say is that you would need something of that scale to underpin that investment in the production of panels. You can do boutique jobs here, like you've got obviously M Square and Tindo that are doing their manufacturing here. But if you look at some of them, I think they're half or more of their products going to America, going to Vietnam and other places for political reasons. So I don't think they're even servicing the Australian market that actively, if I'm not incorrect.
Yeah, I thought M Square had their panel pulled off the CEC list last I heard.
Yeah, that's correct, but they don't care because they're exporting it. So they're still making panels, but they're not selling them here.
Oh, well, at least they're still employed and doing stuff. So actually that raises the next sort of question I had for you, Thomas. Let's say I'm an importer of a panel and distribution channels change over time. I'm a solar wholesaler. I bring in a panel, I have a bit of a disagreement. I find that, I'm not competitive or whatever. So I say, bugger it, I'm not going to bring that in anymore. And then another distributor takes on that. What chance has a consumer got of being able to go back to that manufacturer or that wholesaler, and claim a warranty if the unthinkable happens down the line?
Yeah, I mean, you just can't actually quantify that, right? Because each case would be different. So, for example, if you had like a one-man band, maybe importing panels, just sitting up on, I don't know, mid-north coast of New South Wales or something, just importing panels, and then just decides that they don't want to do panels anymore, they'd much rather go drive buses or something, well, then your chances are really quite limited, aren't they? If the distributor is someone with a bit more roots, a major distributor that's been around for 5, 6, 7 years, well, potentially they'd be around a bit longer to service it. But we have seen this before with distributor-backed imports of panels. And obviously I'm completely biased, but I think that it does need some thinking about. Not to say that you can't have these small importers doing panels, but obviously if you have a company like, for example, Bosch, that's imported the panels under their own name, if they decide to go out of doing panels, you've got Bosch to call on. If you go to a bigger provider, like, for example, a Jinko, a Trina, a JA, something like that, where they have the office here in Australia, if the distributor changes their market focus. So we've got distributors who've gone out of solar here in Australia, don't we, that mainly do pumps now and things like that, or that mainly do wireless or whatever.
Oh, absolutely.
At least you can call on, if you bought Trina from those people or even BP, there's a pathway to call on it. But the tip here for installers would be to look at the companies that underpin the warranty. So is there a limited liability company here in Australia? And then you can go to ASIC and you can see who owns that company. If, for example, you had a company and it was called Bosch Solar Australia, you could go to ASIC, look up Bosch Solar Australia, and it would say owned by Robert Bosch, which is Bosch Group, right? If you go in there and you see that it's owned by Craig McLaughlin or some individual, then you understand,
Luke Beattie.
Yeah, this is a good point.
It's more risky. And it has been discussed before, should this be allowed or not? And the final view, as I understand, is that, it should be allowed, because if you take that away, it's too anti-competitive in the market. Like, let's say you said, we're just going to have big manufacturers. Then all of a sudden you potentially only have 10 providers.
We've seen those sort of cases where it sits with the local entity, but there's a back-to-back warranty with the manufacturer. I don't know what that means, whether they're going to carry it. But if we're particularly talking 25-year warranties, you really want the manufacturer to, ideally, they've got a local office and presence, and ideally they're the ones underwriting that warranty.
Look, I'll just give you the case of True Value Solar. They've imported a bunch of panels themselves. They've ceased trading, as you'd be aware, and there's no fallback position for those customers. So I'm talking about installs from maybe 8 or 9 years ago with small brands like Shanghai Tongfeng and all this kind of thing, and even rebadged panels that were installed by people like Clear and New Energy and this sort of thing. Yeah. Even though there's a back-to-back warranty, you get your panel off the roof and it says New Energy on the back. You then go to try and find the warranty online. Well, the website that told you who the back-to-back cover is from you can't find it. So the average consumer, let's say 7 years into the project, they've not kept their records. They've thrown them out. And that's just my experience. So because True Value Solar, when they shut down, they put our phone number on their website. They owed some money to us, as a kind of how are you? They put our phone number as their top listed thing. Not sure if it's malicious or not, but the result is the same. Every old lady that ever got a True Value system calls up Jinko. As a result of that, we can understand the pain that they're going through. And you guys might not be aware, but I'm really involved in SEA, which is the Installer Association. I'm an installer and an electrician. And it really pisses me off that there's no way for them to be able to get any kind of help or any understanding of what's going on with their systems. They're just left with a document that says 20 tier 1 panels, and they have no clue what's on their roof or anything like that.
It just reflects badly on our industry. I was speaking to Matt Wilkins from South Australia, Venergy, during the week, and he said they're super proactive with their after-sales service, and they get phone calls to the office, someone saying, you installed my solar 3 years ago, I've got an issue with it, and they want to jump right on it. But what they've worked out is that they haven't always installed the system. It's not always their system. The customers just call them because somehow they've found their way to them. And they need to qualify whether it's theirs or not. They're going to help the customer any which way. But what they're finding is that the consumers are confused. As you said, a few years down the track, a lot of people don't know which company installed it. That's usually the first question. If I have family or friends get a system, I say, oh, that's great. You went solar. Who did it? And half of them can't answer.
Interesting you should say that, Luke. Another one is the warranties are a long period of time. And we know that, the statistics show that people only own a house for 7 years. So, how transferable is that warranty between owner A, owner B, owner C, and then owner D, 20 years down the line?
Yeah, in most cases it is transferable. The problem is that the customers who might own it, 3 house owners in, for example, as you said, in a 25-year period, you might be looking at 4 owners. Let's say it's year 21, so we're 3 owners deep. Them getting details of that system is very hard. They'd effectively have to climb on the roof. And for most people, that's a really scary thing. Like, sometimes I have to stop myself because I'm one of those weird people. I'd probably have a sandwich up on the roof. I don't care. Like, I find it quite safe and fine. But for average people, and particularly older people that can't maybe get up a ladder, to even find out whether they might be able to get warranty, they need to get a technician out, which is a bit of a pain in the butt for them, right? Because let's say they get someone out to jump on the roof and then they find that it's QSE panels with no support. Well, effectively, they've dumped even further money into this problem and they've got no recourse, right? And for most people, if they do have 4 or 5 broken panels from, let's say, QSE or even a big company, probably the whole array will need to be replaced to get it back up and running because there's just no matching panels.
QSE were really good for the industry, Thomas, because you could demonstrate every mode of failure. They had all of them. They had burnt back sheets. They had failed back sheets for UV. They had failed junction boxes. They had failed plugs. They had snail trails. They had water ingress. They had the whole lot.
Yeah, they were terrible. I think HCB Solar, if I'm not wrong, up in the Hunter, they had a Ulika panel and a QSE one in the showroom that they used to show people and say, this is why you don't buy shite, which I found pretty funny. But yeah, we just, as an industry, if we don't look at these things and sort them out, then over time, people will tell their friends, look, solar's bullshit, don't get it. If you go out into the rural communities where solar has a longer pedigree, a lot of guys out there just tell you, nah, mate, we've got solar back in the early thousands, it's rooted. That's just how a lot of people talk to you. So
yeah. I'd like to jump back to the pricing. You mentioned about how upstream costs and the cost of producing modules has gone up, and mentioned shipping costs as well, which we've discussed in the past. And the forecasts are that the shipping costs aren't going to come down again. Now, we've had this cheap stock in market, as you said, distributors selling at or below cost. It's quite likely in the next couple of months or so that cheaper stock is going to wash through. Before I throw to you and talk about, you can tell us where the actual panels are going in terms of their cost. In that time as well, the exchange rate has dropped. I think it's around 68 currently, but it's dropped sub 67 recently. So from the heights of 75, thereabouts, that 8 cents goes straight onto the panel in AUD. So that's an additional 8 cents thereabouts that people are going to get. Now, without speaking about specific pricing on panels, I would say the pricing is still artificially low compared to where stock has been landed. If we take that overstock situation out of the equation, where do you see the market going over the next 6 months?
In general terms, we'd probably say that whatever you're paying for panels, you're probably going to be paying at least 10 cents a watt more than what you were paying in June. So if we turn around in August, and we're sitting in the end of August, if you're not paying 10 cents a watt more for your panels, that's like amazing. So as you said, a lot of the prices are loss-making that you've been seeing, and they don't represent the real price even in June. And different people choose to lose money at different rates. So the same product from different distributors might be at different prices just for the reason that they've got pressure to sell them. Now, that'll come out, as you said, with all the extra panels cleared that they couldn't sell earlier with the wet weather. Then we would expect the panel pricing itself to increase something like 10% in US dollar terms at the factory level. The freight probably not headed up. We're not seeing signs of that, but just FYI, like last year, we were paying about $15,000 per container. Bear in mind, 2 or 3 years ago before COVID, it was like $1,000. So it went from being around 1,000, maybe 1,500, maybe 3,000 in a peak, up to 15 grand. In recent times, you're typically seeing between 7 and 8,000 for the container, and that translates, I think, to around 3 cents a watt or 2 cents a watt, something like that. Definitely at the end of this year, like in Q4 calendar, so maybe things that are shipping from China in October and arriving in November, or shipping in November, arriving December, easily expect the containers to be 9, 10,000 or 3 cents a watt. So just the freight component will be up about 30% of where it's been in the last few months. So yeah, it's not a good story, I guess you might say, but the currency is the real thing that no one can do anything about, because as a wholesaler, if you hedge, so you go and lock your foreign exchange, you're gambling. And if you don't hedge, you're gambling. So whichever way you go, you're gambling. Because let's say you hedge the exchange rates, that means lock it so it can't be changed. Then maybe it gets better. So maybe the Australian dollar strengthens and your competitor didn't hedge and now they can sell the panels cheaper than you. You just have to sell at a loss. Then maybe you don't hedge and the exchange rate gets really bad. Well, then your panels will be expensive compared to someone that does hedge. So all we can say is that it's a very difficult thing to predict. The Commonwealth Bank, amongst others, has looked at the fundamentals of Australian dollar and said, look, we're probably not going to raise interest rates as aggressively as the US. We're probably going to see deteriorating terms of trade. So what that means, the prices paid for the things that we sell will be less. And then obviously the demand is also less. So I'm sure you guys would have seen in the news, the construction in China is reduced, manufacturing's turned off for COVID shutdowns. That basically means less steel and less iron ore demand, which is the primary driver of demand for Australian dollars. So in a nutshell, without some other factor, we could see an exchange rate that's 10% down even on where we are now, which we haven't even seen the prices at the wholesaler showing that. Yep. So in another way of cutting it, it's going to increase pretty wildly, I would think, around August, September at the wholesale level, and then it will keep tracking up into January, February, and then it will stabilise.
John Grimes was on the last episode and made a really good point. He said, as those price increases come upstream, they must be passed down the chain in order for us to have a sustainable industry.
Wholesalers have been wearing it for a long time and they just can't keep doing that. And the other thing is the silicon price. I didn't mention it. You did touch on it just earlier. You've got prices like 300, 310 renminbi per kilo. Those are prices I think hadn't been seen since 2008. When it was at the 280 level, it hadn't been seen since 2011. Like, these are long periods of time. And the good news, I guess you might say, is silicon as a total cost is a little bit less in each module now because we get more watts from each kilo of silicon. But even if you adjust for that, it's still chronic high, the price for silicon, and it's expected to head up because some of the production in Xinjiang is not available for us to use. And then some of the facilities are getting maintenance and all that sort of thing that they've kind of put off when the prices have been high. They've been trying to make hay, but at some point you've got to turn it off and do your maintenance. And then as a final factor, the demand in Europe is really high because of their shortage of oil and the shortage of gas. People are looking for energy independence. And I think you were mentioning about the EV bike before. Look, EV bikes, EV cars, all those sorts of things are also increasing demand for solar panels. So in aggregate, the demand side is huge.
You had me at you thinking the exchange rate could drop another 10%. All I could hear was, I need to order another Tesla.
Yeah, possibly. I mean, you could order anything and sell it later. It'll probably be worth more. But yeah, it's a tough time for the industry. But when you're quoting jobs that have got a long-term outlook, so for example, you're working with Lend-Lease, they're going to finish the building in November. They want you to price them now. The contract must have rise and fall. If they don't let you have rise and fall, you just can't enter into it.
Yeah. Well, it's not like we're buying Twitter here.
In which case, it'll just fall, right?
The whole thing seemed bizarre in the first place. I mean, at the end of the day, you've got Elon on one hand saying that he's setting fire to not trash cans full of money, but, dumpster fire or even, Springfield tire fire amounts of money to try and get these factories up to speed. And I guess it's the same in the solar manufacturing space. To set up a facility that does 20 gigawatts, you need to find $8 billion. It's a lot of money. So I'm imagining when you set up a gigafactory, there's billions and billions of dollars to spend. And obviously he's having to spend the money in order to be able to ramp and scale. Yeah, crazy times.
Yeah, and you've also got to permit a factory, right? So let's say you wanted to increase your scale of your silicon facility. Let's say you've got the money. You've still got to then go and do community consultation, got to figure out a strategy for the waste streams. There's so much work in it. You're probably talking 2-3 years normally. Now, the good news is there are some facilities under planning that are probably going to finish construction after Chinese New Year. So you're looking probably around that March, April, maybe into June period. After that, we'll see some relief in the uptick of the silicon price.
That's a long way away from hitting solar panel manufacturers. That one's an 18-month glimpse of the future with the crystal ball. Thank you.
That's right. And watch the exchange. So today, that's at 68 cents. If you see that Aussie dollar plummet more and more, that is going to find its way to the market. Just touching on what you were saying about hedging or not hedging. Also, the other factor is that people may pay upfront for product. But if people put it on terms for 2 or 3 months, the exchange rate's not realised until they actually pay for the stock. So a wholesaler might buy at a certain rate and they're selling based on that certain rate. But then if they have 60-day terms, 30-day terms, 90-day terms, they're carrying the exposure of that. So they're either hedged and they've got, as you said, that's a risk in one regard, or if it goes down at that 60 or 90 days, when they actually pay, that's when the exchange rate's realised.
Yeah, that's right.
When Thomas says that there's gambling involved here, hedging isn't free. I don't just get to stick my hand up and say, hey, lock the exchange rate at 68 cents. There's a cost involved in this, right? I'm actually placing a bet. I'm putting money down, right?
Being American must be so easy. Like everything's just in your own currency. You don't have to worry about it, right? But for everyone else, they do. If you're a business, you have to manage it. If you're an installer, you have to pay for the higher price when the exchange rate falls. So no one gets away from it in Australia.
Now, Thomas, you speak Chinese, Mandarin. What's the story behind that? You're quite fluent. How long have you been speaking that for?
Probably 20 years, I guess. Yeah, so I learned that in high school. A fella called Wayne Goss, which was the Premier of Queensland way back in the dark 90s. He had this idea that Asia was close to Australia, which I don't know why you'd think that. But anyway, he was like, let's get all these kids in the rough areas of Brisbane to learn foreign languages, which, seems a bit ambitious. But anyway, so in our area, we had to learn Chinese. So that's where that came from. And then from that, I went to work in Fortitude Valley at the National Bank, which is where there's a lot of Chinese people in Brisbane at that time. And after that, did solar. And of course, there's a lot of Chinese people in solar, as you may have learned. So that's how that came about. But yeah, people are very interested in that. But all the Chinese people that are in our value chain, they all speak amazing English. And sometimes they don't get credit for that. It really blows my mind that they can review complex legal contracts and stuff like that. So last night with my colleague from China, we had the joy of reviewing a contract about 50 or 60 pages long from 6 till 10 p.m. in a Zoom meeting. And he's doing that in a foreign language. I thought, wow,
So is yours more conversational? Do you use it much for business, or is it more just conversational and being social?
I'm really interested in it, so I do it all the time. So we just speak Chinese in the office as much as possible, at least from my point of view. So yeah, I know the technical stuff. I'd probably be a bit lost if you gave me some poetry and said, tell me the intricacies of this haiku or something. Probably struggle with that. But if you want to talk about atmospheric pressure or something, or solar and voltage and silicon, then it's all good.
Does anyone get surprised by it?
Yeah, I kind of forget that it is a bit jarring for people. So yeah, it does happen that you speak in Chinese to people and other people are next to you, and they're just like, what's going on here? It's like something nefarious, like a spy or something. I don't know. You get some weird reactions.
You could start a TikTok page. There's guys who make a living off it, I suppose, from going and ordering food and everything else in Mandarin.
Yeah, I've seen that, but it's a bit. I don't know if it's narcissistic or what it is. It sort of seems a bit like weird. I don't know. I like solar, so happy to talk about solar.
It's funny that the only trip, sadly, that I've made to China, when you speak to them in English, people want to speak to you and they want to practice their own language skills talking to you, which I thought was really flattering. I'm dumb as a box of hammers, can't understand anything, but they actually actively want to speak to us and hone their own English skills. Whereas for people like me, someone speaks Chinese, I'm just completely lost.
Yeah, no, they're definitely very committed to getting better at everything in China, like just in general, and English is one of those things. And it's funny, you go to somewhere like China and everyone does speak English, and a lot of my friends get used to that, and then they go to Japan or Korea and they're like, no one can talk English. Not like, obviously there are people, but in comparison it's not as prevalent.
Now that's all we've got time for today. Thanks for coming along today, Thomas, and can everyone see you in Sydney next week?
Absolutely. See you at Energy Next.
I'm working on building up my frequent flyer miles, Thomas, so I'll see you there.
All right, see you there.
Any last words before you sign off, Thomas?
Oh, I just hope that everyone looks after each other. It's a tough time, and wherever possible, just reach out and talk to each other, because that work-life balance thing and all those things with the rain, that's putting a lot of strain on folks. That's all I'd just suggest. If you can't go to Energy Next, then maybe ring a mate or something.
Actually, speaking of which, Thomas, that's one thing that we like to talk to our guests. So in a couple of minutes, how do you manage the work-life balance in the solar coaster?
I'm the worst person to ask. It's a big challenge for us. There's very high urgency, as you would know. A lot of times you've got to get a job done tomorrow. So a lot of the questions can't wait in our industry. And so, I've unfortunately got no solutions for it other than to say that we just got to sometimes take a breather and plan ahead, and that sometimes takes some of the heat out of it. A lot of the stresses that installers face, from what I can see, a lot of the time is because it's trying to be done at the last minute. If somehow we can look at scheduling or talk to other colleagues and improve in that area, that I think will have some benefits. But it's just such a hard question, isn't it?
Still a good answer.
Right.
Well, hey, Thomas, I always kind of give a quick wrap up at the end of the show. I'm super stoked, excited that every fortnight we manage to get an incredible person from the solar industry to come on the Solar Podcast. This week, again, I'm blown away as usual. You're the first person we've had on the show that speaks fluent Chinese. So thanks very much for coming on the show with us.
Thanks again, Thomas, and thanks for listening. Please subscribe, follow, and like, and share it around to anyone who might get benefit. Have a good one.
Have a good one. See you guys.
Cheers.